Some 437 days since The Sun's bombshell front page, Edwards today appeared in court to learn his fate, his once glittering career in ruins. Our exclusive that he paid a youngster thousands of pounds for sexual pictures made headlines around the globe and set into motion a series of events which plunged the BBC into crisis. And Edwards, at the time the BBC's highest earning newsreader, never again appeared on our screens. Today, a court heard Edwards paid a younger convicted paedophile £1,500 for child sex images and videos of children, which he described as amazing. The case centred on messages between sex offender Alex Williams, who was a teenager when they struck up a relationship, and 63-year-old Edwards. We must be clear, the facts of that case are unrelated to our original story, but there are some alarming similarities in his exchanges with both young people and a pattern of deeply disturbing behaviour. He made contact with both on social media, messaged them on WhatsApp, harassed them for pictures and then gave them money. There were kisses involved and Christmas presents given. Chillingly, he even bought both of them, who are decades younger, a pair of trainers, and all in exchange for sexual pictures. Cash was used as leverage to the men, one homeless, the other a student, who could only dream of earning his top salary. What The Sun uncovered was a pattern of behaviour, and had we not done so, Edwards could well have remained undetected. An independent inquiry by Deloitte would later result in the BBC being forced into a grovelling apology, after it was found it did mishandle the family's complaint. But far worse was to come for Edwards. As powerful friends tried to save his reputation, the police were closing in. As a court heard in August, police went on to discover Edwards had been messaging Williams and receiving child abuse pictures from him. Edwards, who had told the nation of so many of its gravest crimes, had failed to raise the alarm. He would go on to be arrested and charged, and the BBC severed all ties. Efforts are underway to recover cash paid to Edwards after his arrest. The public, who so often turn to Edwards and his BBC bulletins to be guided through bad news, is appalled. But today's sentence would not be the end of the story for the BBC. The scandal has reached the highest levels, with Director General Tim Davie coming under huge pressure, and the BBC accused, yet again, of a lack of transparency over an abuser in its ranks. It remains to be seen whether the BBC's leader can steer the corporation through what has been one of its most damaging crises, and cling on to his own highly paid job.
This is a bigger fall from grace, a far bigger fall from grace in a way than even Jimmy Savile. I mean, obviously, Huw Edwards' crimes were nowhere near as heinous, but Huw Edwards was the voice of the BBC. It was the voice of authority, the voice of decency, which followed in a long line from Robert Dougal and John Humphreys and Angela Rippon and all these people who were beyond doubt in their moral probity, etc., etc. And so to see this happen, which is a terrible thing to happen, and so that fall from grace, terribly, terribly damaging to Huw Edwards and his marriage, obviously, even more damaging to the BBC, which behaved fairly disgracefully over this episode. You will remember how the BBC employees, the BBC itself, and various other useful idiots in the media, such as Owen Jones, attacked and excoriated the Sun newspaper, which behaved in an incredibly moral way in bringing to justice the business that Huw Edwards had conducted with a young man whose parents were genuinely worried about what was happening there. And all the Sun did, if you remember, was report that the BBC had kind of kicked the whole thing into the long grass and hadn't taken any action. And the Sun had been absolutely right in everything it said. And there should be an apology from the likes of John Sopel and Emily Maitlis and Owen Jones, of course, and say, yeah, actually, the Sun got it right. We're sorry. For the BBC, at first they dissembled. At first they didn't take the complaints from these people, these parents, these worried parents, seriously. And then, when it became clear that he was guilty of far graver offences, which is, creating pornographic images of young children in the worst possible category, they bunged him 200,000 quid. Well, it's beyond belief. The real problem for the BBC is that its complaints unit is useless. Its job isn't, at the moment, to deal with the complaints from the licence fee payers and to put right what has gone wrong. it's to minimise trouble for the corporation, and it's always been that. And that's what it tried to do. Usually what it does is try to ignore something, hope it goes away, deny everything. And then, of course, it's all much, much worse in the end when it turns out to be true. You need a clear out of the complaints department. And possibly, and this seems to me a kind of sensible thing to do, and independent people brought in from outside the BBC to sit in that complaints department and say, yeah, actually, you better not kick that into the long grass. It looks to me quite important. And I think that could be something useful, which Tim Davie does, in order to put right some of the wrong that the BBC has committed over the terrible Huw Edwards business. This is bigger in a sense that even though the crimes are not comparable, and they're not, Huw Edwards is a bigger figure for the BBC than Jimmy Savile ever was. I know Jimmy Savile had the audience. He didn't have the audience that Jimmy Savile had, but he had the authority. He was kind of one step removed in a way from being the very voice of the BBC. So that's an enormous thing for the BBC to get to grips with. Quite clearly, the BBC not merely ignored the original complaints or tried to get rid of them or tried to ignore them. It also ignored complaints from some of Huw Edwards' own colleagues. You know, it took no action. It was scared. And this is a problem with a vast bureaucracy which operates outside the commercial sector. It just closes in on itself and protects itself. And the truth very rarely sees the light of day until someone like the Sun comes along.